Hello and good afternoon, everyone. It is so nice to see so many of you back here. Hopefully not too many. I thought it was only me who has to come every week. But we're going to be talking to you today about the value of admissions tests when applying for a course at Oxford, Cambridge, and also at medical school. I'm joined this week by my colleague Harry. Harry, if you'd like to introduce yourself. He's on mute, isn't he?
Of course, we're on mute. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name's Harry Gwynne. I'm the head of admissions.
And for those of you who haven't come to loads of these, my name is Matt. I look after our research team here at UniAdmissions. And so my job is to make sure that all the things that we present in this webinar, that Harry and the others will talk to you about the phone, all the resources we put together, all of that is stuff that we can back up with evidence as being really effective, which is really important to us as an organisation. Now, one of the central ways we talk about that is through the admissions tests. So we're going to be talking today about how the different parts of your application are weighted when you're applying for these courses we've talked about, what the data say about each subject. We're looking at a couple of examples there. And we'll be talking about the importance of admissions tests and how much of a factor they play in your application. So it's going to be quite a lot of graphs and data and things like that. So if you enjoy that sort of thing, well, here we go.
You're in the right place.
Sorry?
I said, if you're enjoying that sort of thing, you're in the right place.
Yes, absolutely. So to start off with, one thing to bear in mind is how the admissions process has changed over the last couple of years. The first thing to take into account here is that the rate at which students are getting the very top A-level grades has really gone up. Now, we know this is mostly due to the centre assessed grades over the last couple of years, but it has had a big impact on the university admissions process, because where previously you would have maybe only, as this graph suggests, 20% of students getting an A in a given exam, and so the share of students getting 3 A's proportionately smaller. That share of students getting A's and A stars has more than doubled over the last couple of years. And we see a similar pattern with GCSEs as well, although not quite as pronounced, where GCSE scores have gone up a lot compared with 5 or even 20 years ago. And so the impact of this is that the relative weight of things when it comes to university applications changed a fair bit. Harry, are you ready for the pie chart? Can I leave you to do the pie chart?
I am ready for the pie chart.
Here we go. This is a classic of the webinar. I've been doing this, I think, since we started, but take it away.
Right, so this is a pie chart showing how they weight applications for Oxbridge. Now, as you can see, the A-level predictions constitutes a very small slice of the pie. And as Matt says, this has changed over time, but A-level predictions, 10%. Now, this is interesting. A lot of people think, oh, I've got 2 A stars or predicted or 3 A stars or whatever. And that's going to maybe not carry me over the line, but it's going to put me on a good footing. Okay, maybe it puts you on a good first footing, but as you can see on the pie chart, it's a very small part of the consideration. Then I'm going to come to everything else: reference, extracurricular, supercurricular. What else is going on in your life? Background. You know, there's some consideration over the school you go to. If you go to a school that sends a lot of people to Oxbridge, it counts against you, whereas they do take consideration if the school is underprivileged, etc. They take that into account, so that's a positive lean for you. But overwhelmingly, admission test scores in the orange and interview in the yellow. So those are 40% each. The other two pieces, 10%. So everything else and your A-level predictions are not going to get you in to Oxford and Cambridge. It's those other two big pieces that are going to get you in. And
Harry's absolutely Harry's absolutely right, because the because the amount of information that you can get as a university from the A-level results and the predictions and the GCSEs has gone down because students are doing better, you're having to put much more weight on the interview and the admissions test to figure out who the best is. If you consider that, say, 20 or 30 years ago, you would have only a handful of students applying with straight A's. That gave you a good indication of which students were better than others. Whereas now, if almost everyone applying has straight A's, you have to find another way of comparing them. This is made more difficult by the fact that there haven't been, up until I guess I think they've already started A-levels, I think they're happening even as we speak. The last couple of years, there haven't been formal exams, and so you haven't been able to make really direct student comparisons because they won't have been assessed in the same way. And so it means for the last couple of years, the admissions test has been the only thing that every student applying has done the same, and that has made an important difference there. Now, this can all seem a little bit off-putting and scary, but there are a couple of things to say that are really positive about this kind of balance of the situation. First thing to say is you still have loads of control over your chances of getting in. The GCSEs, the A-level prediction, your background, these things, you can't change them, but also they're not the most important part of your application. That admissions test score is going to turn out to be more important than your GCSEs, more important than those A-level predictions. And so really focusing your energy on that in a smart way is going to really improve your chances, particularly compared with another student who might be spending a lot of time shuffling around commas on their personal statement and underrating the importance of the admissions test. So thinking a little bit about GCSEs as well, to kind of drive home the point, the GCSE scores of students are surprisingly varied between subjects, and there's a surprisingly small gap between the people who apply and the people who get the offers. Some subjects, particularly those that are more widely available for students from more expensive schools, something like classics, GCSE scores tend to be very high. Whereas for subjects that are more popular with students from a kind of wider base, the GCSE score students are getting tend to be a little bit lower. And that's in large part because they aren't being used as the most important part of the application. If you have done pretty well in your GCSEs, you are still a perfectly good applicant. It's not as though you need to have nothing but 9s or nothing but 8s. You can get away with having a couple of 6s and 7s in there. The GCSE really isn't destiny at all. No, I haven't converted these scores over to the new system yet, but hopefully we can remember when they used to be letters before they were numbers. So looking at natural sciences, which is the most popular course at Cambridge, the average applicant is going in there with a couple of A's and a B, whereas the average offer holder is only a little bit above that. So remember that the average offer holder, half of people are doing better than that, half of people are doing less well. And because there's a kind of capping effect that goes on here where you can't actually do very much better than 9 A's, I guess you could only in this instance have 11. You get a lot of students who are getting offers, who are getting interviews, even with a couple of B's and only a handful of A stars in there, which I think is encouraging. We see the same thing for English, where there's still a mix of engineering. That's a worry if I've forgotten how to read at this early stage, where you've got a mix of grades there again, and students with B's at GCSE are still getting offers. It's a little bit more competitive with medicine, but we also know that medicine is, medicine at Oxford really is the top tier. But again, these aren't these completely crazy GCSE scores. We're not talking about someone getting 12 or 15 A stars. I'm not sure how many GCSEs you get capped off at these days. And even for subjects like law, we're still seeing a mix of, here we're only looking at half A stars, the rest of them are A's and B's when it comes to the average applicant, and not a huge difference between that and the offer holder, just a couple of extra, just bumping 2 of those up a mark. And even for maths, I'm gonna go out on a limb and suggest this might be the average maths applicant didn't do all that well in English. But we're still not seeing completely off the charts GCSE performance. This is all, these are good grades, but there's nothing to think that if you've done a little bit worse than this, or this is roughly where you are, to think you won't make a competitive application, because the GCSEs really aren't all they're cracked up to be, basically. The other thing to think about is the relative competitiveness of the subject you're applying for. This is one of the strangest things about the application process for me as someone who spends a lot of time looking at data, because the number of applicants for each place, depending on the subject, has an absolutely huge variance. So if we think about computer science or PPE, some of the most popular subjects, you will have maybe 15 or 20 people applying for each place. Whereas for some of the less popular subjects, I highlighted chemistry here, but also classics, English, material science, sometimes maths as well, you may only have 3 or 4 people applying for that one place. The thing that always impresses me here is that your chances are, if you're applying for biochemistry, is something like 1 in 7. Around 16% of people are getting an offer for biochemistry at Oxford. But classic chemistry, the offer rate is more than double that. Quite why chemistry has become so unfashionable, I don't know. But if you can live without the bio element of chemistry, then you can more than double your chance of getting an offer. But I feel like a lot of people don't know that. So it's the kind of thing that we think is really helpful to bring out into the open. The other thing to say is, and I'm hoping Harry will have more to say about this, people don't realise that the medical school at Cambridge is much bigger than that at Oxford. So roughly similar numbers of people apply to study medicine at Oxford as at Cambridge, but because the medical school at Cambridge is almost twice the size, your chances of getting in at Cambridge are almost double, simply because there are more places. Is this something you've spoken to many students about recently, Harry? Because I know it's always a surprise when people find this one out.
Yeah, it's something that certainly comes up from time to time in discussions about Oxford versus Cambridge, particularly with medicine. So yes, it's an ongoing thing, really, Matt.
Good. I think it's a useful one to be aware of there. It also means there are slightly different strategies that you can take with the BMAT when we're thinking about Oxford or Cambridge, but that's something we'll be talking about later in the year as we close in on the BMAT. But yeah, if you are torn between subjects, if you're not sure whether you want to do classics or English, whether you're not sure if you want to go to Oxford or Cambridge, if you think you wouldn't actually be all that unhappy doing chemistry, it's worth having a look at these numbers, which are all fully available on university websites, or we're more than happy to talk you through them and see if it makes a difference to your application. Because if it really is two subjects that you're happy with either, but one has, you know, double the competitiveness, then I think this is always something worth looking at, and you know, important part of how we approach these things.
Yeah.
Now we've carry on.
No. I think one of the things that we often say is, you know, you can't game the system ultimately. You know, there is a certain required standard of academic background, academic performance. That said, you can stack the odds both in your favor and against your favor. And there's various things that you can do, and some of that is your course selection, your college selection, your university selection in some cases between Oxford and Cambridge, and then a lot of it is your preparation. You know, it's not true that anyone can get in with the right preparation, unfortunately, but well, I don't know, unfortunately, but it's not true. But you can stack the odds in your favor. So I think, you know, it's weighing up what your heart wants, and, you know, if you're really drawn to that course versus how much that's going to statistically affect the chances. Same with Oxford and Cambridge, and you've got to come to some middle ground in the end.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It's you want to maximize your chances as best you can within that kind of window of things you're happy with. You know, we're never going to say don't apply for this course. But if you are 50-50 between, let's say, PPE and history, then it's worth knowing that your chances of getting in for history are better than their chances for PPE. And so if that's going to be, if you really are on the edge there, that's the kind of thing that can be really helpful to know.
Yeah.
Now, sort of, oh, sorry, carry on.
Sorry, Matt, it's quite hard to change over. There's a slight delay. The other thing I was going to say on that, which it's very hard to quantify in the numbers. You can somewhat, but it's not just 16% versus 35%, or, you know, PPE is a classic example of a very competitive course. You might say, okay, well, 9% of applicants get in for that, but there's 20% for another course. Okay, but then what is the quality of applicants as well? There's certain courses, PPE is famous for it, medicine, law, that attract very high quality of applicants as well. So it's hard to quantify that, because it's not just a case of, you know, average grades and things like that. There's a lot more to it, but some courses are competitive beyond the numbers, is what I would say.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. There's you know, you're going to be applying to Oxford as one of the best students from your school, but what you want to avoid doing is being up against, you know, the best students from every school, all trying to crowd into one admissions process. Now, Harry spoke a little bit how difficult it is to quantify this stuff, but I'm going to try. So we'll be looking a little bit about how the admissions tests work and the kind of weight they have in terms of your application. The first thing to say is pretty much every subject at Oxford or Cambridge has a test. For Oxford, most of these are done a couple of weeks after the UCAS deadline. So it will normally be in the first week of November or the last week of October, depending on how the numbers work out, normally on a Wednesday, I think. And that's the case for quite a few courses at Cambridge, but for a few others at Cambridge, they will have you do it when you are there for the interview. So for Oxford, you will have to get through the test to get to the interview. And while that's the case for a lot of courses at Cambridge, there'll be a handful. I think geography at the moment, it changes from year to year. And the information is only just coming out as we get into the new cycle. But some of them will take place when you're there at Cambridge. I expect you're more up to date with this than I am, Harry.
Yeah, I mean, you pretty much just outlined it. They are a little bit all over the place, and obviously we're not going to go into exact dates for all of them here because we haven't got all day. But yeah, they is pretty much as you've laid it out.
And so the latest information we have is that a lot of them are going to be online, but that hasn't worked especially well the last couple of years. So we really hope they're going to be back on paper. But the last I heard was they were still planning to do interviews online, which I think is a dreadful idea, but they seem to be sticking with it. But, you know, watch this space. As soon as we hear anything new, we will let you know. The important thing to see here is the strength of the relationship we see between the admissions test score and your chance of getting in. So this is the Oxford physics test, the physics admissions test, as they call it. And what you can see here is it's a very nice little bell curve sort of shape we've got here, and you see your basic distribution of students, with the average student scoring something like 40, 45 on this. And you see that at that level, hardly anyone is getting an interview. But once we get into the candidates who are above average, we start to see the share of students being interviews creeping up until the point around 67, 68%, where all of a sudden, if you've hit that mark, you'll definitely get interviewed. And we then see, if we look at the curve of students who get offers, what we see there is that while very few students are getting offers at the average mark, I think we've got maybe 1 or 2 students there getting an offer who are scoring roughly on average. When we get to the far end of the graph, you know, everyone who's scoring above, I think it's 88, is getting in, and the vast majority of students who are scoring above 80 are getting in. What we see here as well, which is useful to note, is that you don't get in without the interview. So you can think about this in a slightly more Bayesian way and think, right, I've got to get the interview because without the interview, there's no place. Harry.
Yeah, I was just going to say what Matt says, obviously very correct. And it is interesting, though, that there are people that have got in with very, well, not very low, but very mid-range, low end of this scale PAT scores. So it's not something you want to rely on, but it does show the nuance inherent in the process, that they are creative. They do understand that People have bad days, people have bad GCSEs, but you're not going to get away with bad GCSEs, bad PAT score, and a bad interview. And they go, oh, well, that's not going to happen. But it is interesting to note the distribution. It is heavily skewed, but a fall down at one stage doesn't necessarily mean the whole thing's over for you either.
Absolutely. And we'll see that same pattern recurring as we look through the full range of tests. I've got a few more. So if we look again at Oxford at the maths test, essentially, we see again this very similar pattern. Below a certain score, you're not getting an interview at all. Then as your chance of getting an interview go up and up and up until the point that you're pretty much guaranteed an interview at a certain score. And your chance of getting a place are also highly correlated with that performance in the test. It's something I have been looking to do once we get more larger data sets, but we're looking at a really strong R here for those of you who like to measure these correlations. I think to say here is, because this is just the correlation as well between the score on the test and the outcome, we're not taking into account, as Harry says, things like GCSEs. So if you're worried that your GCSEs aren't brilliant, if you're worried about your personal statement, any of those things, what you can see here is that admissions test score at a certain point is going to guarantee you that interview kind of on its own. And so while your chance of getting an interview aren't zero if you have a more mixed portfolio, there's also so much work you can do with the admissions test in terms of increasing your chance of getting that interview and subsequently that place. I'm going to show a couple more of these now, just to sort of show off the same idea. So this is for the problem solving section of the TSA, which is the test that is used for students applying to study PPE. And we see again a really strong correlation between the chance of getting an interview, chance of getting a place, and the score on that test. And the interesting thing here is, because so many students sit the TSA, because it's such a popular course and such a popular test, you can see just how huge difference a few marks of improvement can make to your chances. If you look at that central column, we can see that there are almost 600 students scoring in the between 60 and 65 band. At that point, you are getting one extra point. You're overtaking that must be something like 100 students you're overtaking with one extra correct answer. And that just goes to show the impact of the test. You can't overtake 100 other kids with a better personal statement necessarily, but we're looking at perhaps one extra correct answer in this test, leaping you over 100 people who you're competing with. And we see the same thing in the critical thinking section of the TSA as well. This incredible clustering towards the center, where those extra handful of marks are making the difference between you having more than 50% chance of getting to the interview if you're scoring over 75, whereas something like a 35% chance if you're scoring between 70 and 75. So a really big difference in terms of just getting 1-2 extra correct answers. Now, interestingly, this goes for the tests that are not based on multiple choice or on maths. It goes for the essay-based tests as well. So if you look at the ELAT, the test for students who are applying for English, those students are banded into 4 categories based on their score. Band 1 being the ones who are going to be interviewed, band 2 probably, band 3 maybe, and band 4 nah, probably not, unless there's another reason. And so you would expect to see with this that the bands would form a really discrete set of 4 categories to determine who gets in. But it turns out, no, it turns out the correlation there is still really strong. What we see is the classic kind of bell curve shape. Very few students are scoring right at the bottom of the ELAT. But the scores are distributed in roughly the way you would expect them to be. And again, that an extra couple of marks, you're suddenly overtaking 50 or 60 students. So that real clustering around at the center. And what we see if we look at the average scores is that the average applicant is over here at getting about 42, the average interviewee is this bit further over here, getting about 46, and the offer holder just that little bit further along over at about 47. And I think the really striking thing here is that even though we've been told that these students have been put into 4 bands, which gives you the sense that there are bigger gaps between them, the difference between getting an interview and getting the offer really is only a couple of marks in the context of the ELAT, and the same for the application and the interview. So for all that the marks are banded, there is this incredibly strong correlation between the score in the ELAT and the outcome of your application. So yeah, those 2 or 3 extra marks, you know, not only are you overtaking maybe 60, 100 other students who are applying, but you're probably pushing yourself from the probably interviewed to the probably offered with only just a couple of additional marks, which is a really big difference. So to sort of summarize all this, because I know there's been a lot of graphs, I'm going to hand over to Harry for in a second to talk a little bit more the kind of work we do beyond producing them. The thing to bear in mind is that even just jumping a few correct answers, something like from the 59th percentile through to the 66th, that can, in some cases, double your chances of interview. And that for some tests may only be 2, 3 correct answers, which spread out over a 30-question test. That really is the difference between you being that bit quicker, that bit better at doing the process of elimination for questions you're not certain about, really having your test skill down, having done that extra bit of preparation. You know, we're talking really marginal gains, but making really big difference to your chances. Now, this isn't going to be the case that so much this year, but because of the GCSEs and A-levels have gone, this sort of admissions test is going to be very close to being the only thing that is identical for every student who's applying. They may be sitting different exam boards, they may be coming from Excel or AQA, they may be doing Scottish Highers, they may even be applying from other parts of the world. And so the one thing everyone will have done who's applying is going to be one of these tests. And so that makes them really important in terms of being a really objective way of looking at what the different answers have done. And as we've talked about, and I hope you've all sort of figured this one out on your own, but the amount of difference you can make to your chance of getting in is so much greater on these tests than it is looking at your personal statement, shuffling some commas around, deciding whether you want to have as many adverbs as you've gone for. These tests are really crucial, and giving them that extra time, improving your test technique, particularly for those of them that have multiple choice components, all of that is going to make such a big difference to your application. But there are other things that can make a difference to the application, Harry, I hope. And I'm going to give you some slides to talk about them.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Matt.
Off you go.
So one thing I'll just say before I get into these slides is a difference that we didn't talk about there that you may or may not be aware about is the difference between Oxford and Cambridge in terms of their interviewing process. So at Oxford, it's more like 40% get an interview. At Cambridge, it's more like 80% and above. So Cambridge will give the benefit of the doubt and interview anyway. And Oxford go for we're going to weed people out early and only interview the people we're realistic about, or maybe realistic but we're more optimistic about, let's say. That's a consideration if you feel like you have a stronger interview performance in you, then but you have weaker test scores, weaker academic background. If you're going to stack the cards, that kind of candidate, we'd say go more for Cambridge. Again, obviously there's a million other factors, and we'd make every decision. Well, you would ultimately make every decision on the individual case. So I just wanted to share that for a little bit of context about those figures that Matt's just gone through. Okay, there's a couple of other bits that I was going to say as well. Yeah,
I just want to say, Harry, the other thing to bear in mind is Cambridge is just better. Just much better.
I'm going to have to disagree with you there, Matt, but I mean, the old adage is that, and most people may be aware of this, that Cambridge is considered better for sciencey engineering kind of subjects, whereas Oxford is a more open-minded, artsy, humanities sort of place. That's an old adage that is broadly true and broadly will have very little impact on your life. No one's ever going to say, oh, well, you did history, but it was at Cambridge, would have been better at Oxford, or you did engineering at Oxford, but would have been better at, it's never going to happen. So yeah, there's that. Okay. The other thing to say about the tests is that some people will say you can't improve on them. That's a line that sometimes the universities come out with themselves. It is not true. It's not true. You can improve. Practice, tuition does improve students' performance on the tests. And if you don't do that, you're missing it. You're missing a very, very large trick in terms of your application.
Yeah. So sorry about that. Windows is angry with me for some reason, but Harry's absolutely right. There really is nothing in life you can't improve with practice, and these tests are no different from that. And so yeah, we'll talk a little bit how we help you practice. First off, we've got the selection of resources we have available. Oh no, we haven't. Sorry, it's tuition. Harry, tell us about tuition. I thought I had updated those so that the images were in the same order as the slides, but evidently not.
Straight in with the tuition. Okay, so just let me take a step back before we go into the tuition. So we are primarily an Oxbridge prep school. We also prep people for medicine in other places, and now increasingly prep other, LNAT and things like that for other universities as well. But primarily we're an Oxbridge prep school. And what that means is that we work with students through all stages of the process, though we will create particular programs for particular students, and work with them and their families to get something that works for them. But fundamentally, we have curriculum in place that we've refined over the last more than a decade to get down what actually works, what improves the student's chance, and in the end gets them to where they want to go. So how do we do that? Well, one of the ways we do it is through one-on-one tuition. In some ways, this is a cornerstone of what we do, but there's different types of one-on-one tuition. You can just get matched up with a tutor of unknown renown and said, I tutor this student, and that's what some people do. It's not what we do. As I say, we have a curriculum that we've written, things that the tutor is going to work through. Then it's who are the tutors. So in our case, all of our tutors are Oxbridge people. Again, except for medicine, we have some non-Oxbridge medical tutors, but primarily they're Oxbridge as well. And they have all scored in the top 10% in their tests. So that's our starting point for recruiting tutors. Most of them we worked with for a number of years. We have very good relationships with them, and they've been through this process themselves. They've succeeded themselves, and then they know how to help other people succeed, and they've helped other people succeed. We see perverse situations sometimes, not in our own business, that people who haven't done this themselves or haven't succeeded themselves are tutoring people to try and do something that they themselves couldn't do. That's not something we would ever do. Okay, that's it. So typically we'd do about 30 hours with a student of one-on-one preparation time. But as I say, the one-on-one preparation is only a small part of what we do. We work on rounding the student, and that doesn't mean sitting down for the maximum number of tuition hours with one tutor. That's not what rounding a student's about. Okay, so next slide, please. Resources. So as a company, we've written over 100 books. As far as I'm aware, in existence beyond what we have produced, there are about 10 books. So we've really, really spent a long time going into detail about every aspect of this process, how it can be improved, how it can be worked on, where the holes are, where the gaps are. And so every interview test, every admissions test, personal statement guides, interview guides, general subject guides, college selection guides, Oxford versus Cambridge guide, medical interview guides, law interview guides, and so on and so on. So all of these resources are stored in something we call the portal, which is an online space where all of our students have access. They can log in, they have the library of all of our work, and they can get to it. So we have there not only all the past tests, of course, but we have our own tests that we've written ourselves, because at the end of the day, there's a limited number of past tests. Everyone has access to them. Okay, if you want an edge, you want extra tests that no one else has access to. And that's what we've written. And we have them in there in questions, in exam simulators as well. So it's not just a printout that you can look at. It's an online simulator, timed. You can work through it just like a real exam. Okay. I think that's it. Oh, we also have, as part of, there's a lot. I'm not going to go into all the resources, but another thing I will mention is that we have an online academy for the ELAT, the TSA, the BMAT, UCAT, etc., etc. So that's another thing to work through. So these things complement the tuition. They're not instead of the tuition. They're, as I say, we work on rounding the student from a variety of different angles. Okay, next slide, please. Enrichment seminars. Okay, so every week we have enrichment seminars. These are university level lectures, helping students to go deep into whatever their subject area is. Now, you can prepare for some things at the last minute. I wouldn't recommend it. But one thing you can't do is develop a knowledge base and a degree of complexity of intellectual inquiry at the last minute. That's something that you can do over a period of months. And your exposure to people who are already operating at that kind of level will really come across when it comes to interview. You can do some mock interviews, as I say, you know, let's do 4 mock interviews the day before your interview. Yeah, it will probably help. It will help, but it's not going to, it will polish your presentation. It won't polish who you are as a candidate. But over a longer period with these enrichment seminars, that's exactly what we can do, because our goal is not just to make people appear to be good candidates for the day that they turn up at interview. Our goal is to actually help people to fulfill their potential and to be the candidate that they can be. So that's why we do these enrichment seminars. They're weekly. We also record them. Of course, we appreciate life goes on and you're not able to attend all of them perhaps. So we record them so you can watch them separately. It's great exposure to different people as well. Exposure to different tutors is one of the cornerstones of what we do. If you just work with a tutor, everyone has their strengths, their weaknesses, their areas of expertise, and you know, you get used to that, you get that exposure. But when you come to interview, you're not going to be interviewed by the same person as the person who was your only tutor. And so if that's what you've just got used to, then you may be in for a bit of a rude awakening come interview time. So there's 2 reasons then that it's really important to get this exposure. One is to round your knowledge base and your intellectual curiosity, which can only be provoked by different people at different times. And 2 is to round your interview performance, which everyone has a different interviewing style. If you get used to one person who just asks a lot of shorter questions or is quite deep and methodical, as opposed to someone who just goes for one very long question, or, you know, it's not just the length of questions, but it's the style. Some people are more focused on using a text, other people are more freewheeling, and, you know, they might just, even though your subject has theoretically got not very much to do with, you know, whatever it may be, you know, they might start talking to you about the news and, you know, what you think about gun control in America or something like that. You know, you're not coming to study gun control in America, but they want to see how you're going to approach it. Now, that's the preparation, and being prepared for that sort of thing only comes by being tested by different people. And that's one of the things that you get in the enrichment seminars. To go a very long way around to get back to the enrichment seminars. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we prepare people with the one-on-one tuition. We prepare them by helping them, giving them access to all of these resources, allowing them to work through, and the seminars, as I've just mentioned. And then at the exact point in the process where there's the hurdle to be overcome, be it the personal statement, the admissions test, or the interviews, we have a full day intensive course in each of those. We have obviously different ones for all the admissions tests. And that's going to help the student just peak just at the right time. You know, there's no point in peaking in your TSA performance 2 months before you're going to take the test. Same with the interview. So the tutoring gets them ready, does all the work, and then at the last minute, the icing on the cake, full day intensive, really gets the student up to speed. So when they step into that test room, they step into that interview space, they feel confident and they feel ready to go. I don't think there's anything else particularly to say about those day courses.
No. Thanks, Harry. That's been really helpful. The thing to bear in mind as well is that it does seem to work. Around 60% of the students that we work with are able to succeed in their applications to Oxford or Cambridge, roughly 3 times the national rate. And our success rate is even higher for students applying for medical school, which is something we're particularly proud of, particularly at the moment with the sudden growth and importance of medicine. I know that Harry described as being something of a prep school. Another thing we're particularly proud of is how flatteringly our performance compares with even some of the most expensive schools in the country. We don't have quite the stylish outfits of Eton or of Westminster, but we do have admissions rates for Oxford and Oxford in this case that compare really favourably with theirs, and at substantially lower fees, I believe. But no funny hats, which has always been a source of disappointment to me.
Yeah. But double the acceptance rate of Eton. So, you know, it's you got to pick your funny hats or double the acceptance rate. But
well, as a rapidly balding man, I think I'm probably going to go for the hat, but each to their own. To get a real flavour of the relationship that we build with parents and with students, I really recommend having a look at our reviews on Trustpilot. That'll give you a really clear sense of the way we work, the kinds of relationships we try to build, and also means that's coming from a trusted outside source rather than just coming from sort of inside the house. If you've enjoyed this webinar, please do write a review about how marvellous I am, how marvellous Harry is. That would be hugely appreciated. And do while you're there, take a look at the relationships that we've been able to build with the students in the past. I think, as we've been talking for nearly 3/4 of an hour, which is much too long to listen to Harry, let alone me, we should take some questions. So if you would like to drop your questions into the Q&A section, what we'll do is we will take questions through till I think 3 o'clock. Does that suit you, Harry?
Yep, sounds good to me. So
marvelous stuff.
There's one other generic thing that I'll just say whilst we're kind of waiting for some people to put more questions in. There's obviously already some there. We're going back to the 10%, 40/40 pie chart. Now, there's a certain chronological order to this as well, right? So no one ever got into Oxford or Cambridge because of their good GCSEs, okay? But there are people that killed their application because of bad GCSEs. No one ever got into Oxford or Cambridge because their personal statement was just like, wow, this is like Nietzsche. But there's people that didn't get in because their personal statement was really bad. Admissions test, again, they open the door, but no one's ever got in because of an admissions test. But each one of these steps opens the next door. Your academic background opens the door, personal statement opens it further, admissions test, you walk through the door and then you're in the room and then you've got the interview. And that's ultimately where the decisions are made, obviously taking into account all of the other background. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a little difficult, as Harry says, to create kind of probabilities based around these things, because you have to do all of them one at a time, which is why it's so important to us in terms of the approach that we take to make sure that all of the things we suggest are very much backed up by the data, and so they all build upon each other, so that it's not as though you have spent all of your time preparing for the admissions test and you then arrive in the interview room and you freeze because you aren't ready for it, but that we're planning that progression all the way through. And I think that's why we find that students who spend longer with us, who join us at this time of year, at Easter, sometimes even more than a year ahead, it makes a real difference to their application, because they're working on the interview well ahead of time. They're working on the admissions test, that there's a kind of smooth pathway that makes sure that they're not in the situation of so many students I've spoken to over the years who will get in touch with us just after they've passed the admissions test and they've had the interview invite, and they go, right, so I've got an interview at Oxford next week, can you help? And we go, I mean, we can, but not much. There really is a cap on how much you can learn in a week. And particularly when it comes to rounding out a communication style, developing confidence, that sort of thing, you, for the most part, genuinely can't do in a week. It's taken me the best part of 40 years to be this charming, and I still don't think I would get in.
It's still a long way to go, I think, as well.
Scandal. Anyway, let's take a look at some questions. So,
yeah. Oh, one other thing. Sorry, sorry to interrupt. Just to finish that point off as well. We actually have a Head Start program that we work through with students in year 10 and 11. Now, the people on that program, we have a 75% success rate. So that rises from 61 to 75. So you can see that's obviously, well, I'm going to say it's the long end of preparing early, but the earlier you start, within reason, you know, we're not doing Oxbridge prep for 8-year-olds, but, you know, within reason, the earlier you start, the more likely you are to succeed.
Yeah. Okay, then. We've got a few questions. This question is about law, about the LNAT score, the interview score. So I think something, and this is useful for thinking about the GCSEs in context again. If you do brilliantly on the LNAT, if you're wonderful in the interview, what's going to happen is that they're going to look at your GCSE scores and go, well, that must have been a mistake. You had a bad day. You were ill-suited to the test. And bear in mind as well, you could be, 15 years old doing your GCSEs. 2-3 years later, the maturity, the intellectual sophistication, all of these things are going to have changed. And this is part of how we think about this in terms of the pie chart and the progression Harry talked about. If you're applying to university, you are almost by definition a young person, and the expectation is that you will change and grow and improve over time. And so if there's a piece of information from 3 weeks ago that says this applicant is brilliant, and there's a piece of information from 3 years ago that says they're a bit, they're going to go with the new piece of information because the old piece of information is out of date. Teenagers change a lot. And so you're not going to make decisions based on what they were doing 2 or 3 years ago. You're going to be making decisions based on what they're doing now. So if you can do brilliantly on the tests, brilliantly in the interview, they're not going to look at the GCSEs and go, well, these aren't very good, because ultimately they're not bringing on board the person who did those GCSEs. They're bringing on board the person who did that test, because that person from 3 years ago is gone. They can't get them back, short of getting a time machine. Which I guess we would recommend if you're only getting in touch with us with a week before your interview, but otherwise we don't really have any dealings with the time machine.
The only other thing I would just say on that, Matt, is the question didn't specify GCSEs, but they said very low school grades. Now, it depends what you mean by that. If you're going with 3 Bs predicted, then you better have a pretty amazing reason why, if you're hoping to have a successful application. Now, GCSEs are one thing, they're a step back. Predicted grades and then A-level grades are another thing entirely. Now, if you have weak GCSEs or predicted grades, I mean, something you may want to think about is either waiting until you have your A-level grades and applying then, because if you got bad GCSEs or you had bad predicted grades for A-level, but you still got great grades in the end, well, they won't really care what, by that stage, they don't care what the predicted grades were, and the GCSEs are ancient history. So it depends what you mean by low school grades. It is just how I would just kind of add to Matt's answer there.
Yeah, Harry's spot there. So thanks for sort of picking me up there. We have a couple of questions about medicine from Yasprit and from Tanishka. I would say Oxford and Cambridge are excellent for medicine. And this is something we emphasize a lot when talking to students about medical school in general. Regardless of where you go to medical school, you are a doctor at the end of it. And so I wouldn't get hung up on a case of Oxford or Cambridge or Imperial or UCL. Wherever you go to study medicine, you end up a doctor at the end of it. And so, you know, either Oxford or Cambridge is fantastic, but generally speaking, you're going to be a doctor wherever it is you go, and that's going to be the important thing. So I wouldn't get too preoccupied with universities, specifically when it comes to medicine. In terms of scholarships, you'd have to look at the individual universities you're looking to apply to. It'll also depend on your personal situation, whether you're applying as a home student or as an international student. But we find we get quite a few questions about scholarships, and it's always worth looking into the universities you're interested in applying to before you make any decisions there, as they will have much more detail in terms of information than we're able to provide.
I would just say on that, if you're an international student hoping for a scholarship, there are very, very limited opportunities. There are far more opportunities for UK-based students.
Absolutely, yeah. Sally asked an interesting question about test marking. Could you end up having your interview with someone who had marked your essay? Yeah, this could well happen. The good news is you probably wouldn't know, and they're unlikely to decide to have a conversation with you about the content of the essay that you wrote in your admissions test. We'd always recommend that if you have an essay admissions test, that you write down right after doing the test just some quick notes of what you actually said, just in case it does come back up. But it's fairly unusual. Normally they'll be looking at new pieces of information when it comes to the interview, starting from the personal state sometimes. But I don't think you're going to get pulled up on something you had written in the TSA essay section in your interview necessarily. But it's an interesting thought, and there's every chance that it could be the same person, but you probably won't know until long afterwards.
Yeah, maybe they have a little laugh with you about it in the common room one day, 2 years down the line. But, okay, what are the? Yeah. This is kind of interesting question. What are the reasons that the 40% who you tutor don't get in? Okay. Well, they are numerous, I think, is the reason. They're also nebulous in a sense that they're not always easy to pin down. So there has always been a bit of a lottery about Oxbridge applications. There's always been people who seem like great candidates who just didn't get it for whatever reason. You know, either they've fallen down on the tests at the last minute, their interviews just didn't go the way they were hoping. They were in a very competitive field. I mean, you know, if you're looking at some of the subjects, you know, only 1 in 20 nearly gets in. So even with, you know, 61% is a pan subject figure, right, that we give, and we have more detailed breakdowns. But if you're going for a subject where nearly 1 in 20 people gets in, the odds are very much stacked against you. And, you know, we can obviously help, we can maximize your chances, but even if we triple your chances, still, you know, 75% of people aren't going to get in. So, you know, maybe they just ultimately were not academic enough. You know, we are selective. If someone comes to us and we just think, bless this person, but they're just not going to make it, you know, we won't tutor them because it's giving them false hope. It's a waste of their time and money. So, you know, but it's not our place to either say, you know, if someone's a credible candidate, it's not our place to weed people out early and say, oh, you probably, we will support people and work with them where they're realistic candidates to perform the best they can. And, the reality is there is no system of preparation that's going to guarantee 100% of people get into Oxbridge, and nor should there be, quite honestly.
No, I mean, if we were to, and this is where I sort of try to think about these things probabilistically, if we had a 99% chance of a student getting in, even then, if we were to work with 100 students, we would still have nearly a third of our students wouldn't get in because of the way the statistics work. If you were to have a 1% chance of being hit by a car for a year, the chances of you not getting hit by a car at least once are only 25%. 100% is essentially unobtainable. But of that 40%, the vast majority of those get places at other universities they're perfectly happy with. There's nothing wrong with going to UCL or King's or Imperial. So it's not a binary thing either when it comes to the outcomes those students get.
Yeah, and I think a rising tide lifts all boats, and what we found is that by getting people ready for Oxbridge or improving their medical application or law application more generally, even if they don't get their top target, they're way more likely to get the next down the chain. So there's no guarantees in life. You can stack the odds in your favor, both with regards to Oxbridge and other top tier universities.
Thanks. Alice asks a couple of questions about GCSEs. Does having good GCSE results, but one bad result in a subject that isn't particularly relevant, will that make a huge difference? No, I don't think so. If you're applying for maths and you've done really badly in English, I think probably universities are going to let that go for the most part. But again, it's all a case of making sure that your A-levels, all of those other pieces of evidence are really in your favor. One little thing isn't going to rule you out. So I wouldn't worry too much on that account as long as the relevant things are going well. And for students applying from outside the UK, I've got a couple of questions about that. Generally speaking, if you haven't done GCSEs, and there aren't any GCSEs for them to send to you, it's worth speaking to your school directly to see how they deal with things with UCAS, making sure they have a good level of experience there. And the universities themselves are pretty well experienced with this stuff, so they'll give you a clear sense of how these things work. Something to bear in mind there as well is some examination systems aren't considered to be equivalent to A-levels by Oxford and Cambridge. And so you want to make sure that whatever you're studying now is going to be acceptable to them when you apply. So if you're doing the International Baccalaureate is the most common one, International A-levels, those are both fine. But if you are doing, I believe it was the Saudi Arabian equivalent of A-levels we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, those aren't considered to be equivalent to A-levels. So you would have to do A-levels or another comparable set of exams to be able to put that application in. So that's something that's worth researching before you start.
But you can get a long list from Oxford and Cambridge of what they consider by country, and it will say Qatar, we don't accept. I'm not picking on Qatar, I'm just random country. We don't accept the local whatever, and then Nigeria, we don't, but Malaysia, we do accept this one, but not that one, etc., etc. And if you don't have one that is accepted, you need to do separate A-levels or an IB that is accepted. There's no way around that.
I don't know how you manage that, Harry, because I've popped the list open in front of me, but you were absolutely right. The Qatar one is not accepted, but there are 3 different ones in Malaysia, and one of them is.
Yeah, there we go. Well, what can I say?
Round of applause for Harry, who either guessed brilliantly or knew.
Okay, there's a couple of questions about cost. There's not a set cost. We need to work with individual students, assess where they are, and then we build a package around them. So you need to work through the process with us to kind of get to that. how much do college grades affect your admission if I'm applying for another undergraduate degree? I'm not entirely sure. You mean like sixth form college or existing university college grades? And are we talking a completed degree? Like if you already have a 2-1, will that help you? Well, then you would be going as a graduate student, a senior master's or something like that. So I don't think I can really do much on that one, I'm afraid.
But yeah, please get in touch so we can figure that one out in a little bit more detail, because where there are really specific personal circumstances, it's always helpful to have a conversation.
Yeah, and I will just add as well that some things we can't necessarily just work out in a conversation. Someone needs to be part of the program before we can actually really drill down and go into exact details of their application, just because we don't have capacity to do that as a kind of general service, depending on how much time and drill down is required.
Lovely. There are just for look. Just a couple of questions about the various tests. I recommend having a look both at the resources we produce through the programs. Some of the books are available on Amazon, as well as having a look at the different syllabuses. Each of the tests will have a clear breakdown of what you need to know to be able to do the test. So that's where I would start from, each of the admissions tests for the subjects you're considering, and then sort of building things out from there. But in terms of preparation, if you're going to be doing that test in 4 or 5 months' time, I think it's a really good idea to start looking at that now, alongside beginning work on your personal statement, just so that you've got plenty of time to get used to the style of questions, the format, get the knowledge down. The last thing you want to be doing is doing what so many students do, where they kind of discover the admissions test as a surprise after they've sent in their personal statement. The students who felt they have an interview and then start preparing, getting ready now, getting familiar with the syllabus, starting to practice. The longer time spent you're doing that, the more confidence you'll build, and the more skill you'll develop as well. Is there anything else you wanted to look at, Harry? I'm sorry if we haven't been able to get to all of your questions.
Time limited. I mean, I could just fire. Sorry, I could just fire through a couple of other ones just very quickly. The one about the PAT and the MAT, we can't go into the details of the test particularly now, but it's out there, it's in our resources and things like that. But preparation, I expect you don't have a background knowledge until a certain point. I mean, it depends how many years before. Again, we don't do Oxbridge prep for 8-year-olds or 10-year-olds, but we do prep, as I say, 10 and 11 in a Head Start program, not specifically on the tests, but you can start the process early, and there's lots of people that start tests at the start of the year. So I hope that's helpful. We can't go into the ENGA specifically at the moment. College grades, we kind of talked about, couldn't really do that one. Can I apply for medicine at Oxbridge if I'll be 17? I'll turn 18 in the 3rd term. There's no problem with that, is there, Matt? There's people that go up early.
I believe so. And if you are really at the younger end of your cohort, it's a good opportunity to apply twice if things don't work out the first time round. So I wouldn't let that put you off applying. But I would also say, if you really are going to be, if you're in the fortunate position of being academically brilliant while also being the best part of a year younger than everyone else in your cohort, then it's worth having that opportunity to take a gap year to spend more time developing work experience, all those sorts of things. But for the most part, being 17 is fine.
Yeah. And, as Matt said, you double your chances by applying twice if you have to. That was always my strategy. I thankfully didn't have to, but, and that goes for whether you're younger or not. You can always get your A-levels, take a gap year, apply again, So what is your advice if we get bad predicted grades? Well, that is... you need to think, and you need to be realistic about the subjects and the universities generally. But the alternative is, if you feel like you can do better, get the grades, prove them wrong. Once you've got them in the hand, your predicted grades don't matter.
Absolutely. The other thing to say is if you feel that the school is being unfairly pessimistic about you, do speak to them about it. It may not change things, but it will be useful for your development, for your approach to studying all these things, to understand where they're coming from in terms of those predictions. It may be that they're not prepared to update them, but it's possible that there's a set of reasons that you want to talk to them about that you can kind of work forward from, because these are ultimately predictions, and so they're not expected to be perfect. Like Harry says, you can outperform your predictions, but it's also helpful to know where they're coming from, because there may be factors there that you haven't considered that are important for your development in terms of proving the predictions wrong.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then finally, if my predicted not 2A stars, but can I apply Cambridge, can do well in BMAT? Yes, you certainly can. It depends how far below 2A stars. 1A star and 2As is perfectly respectable. If you go down from there, medicine is very competitive. At Cambridge is very, very competitive. There would have to be some extenuating circumstances if you go down much from there. So that's probably what I would say about that, and just what I said to the person before, that once you have your actual grades, no one will care what your predicted grades were. So if you were predicted 3 Bs and you come away with 3A stars, Cambridge and Oxford, they're not going to care what the predictions were, nor will they ever know at that point. So if you can do it, there's a route for you.
Absolutely, as Harry says, if that's what happens, then that makes the predictors look bad, not you. That means they were wrong and you were right after all. So I think we'll call it a day there. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We'll be back next week when we're going to be talking about preparing for that interview, thinking about that well in advance, developing the relevant skills, and then sort of moving forward from have a lovely week, everybody, and weekend rather. God, it is Saturday, isn't it? And we'll see you then to talk about interviews. Hope many of you as would like. Thank you very much, Harry.
Thank you very much, Matt.
Thank you, and have a lovely weekend, everyone, and goodbye.
Okay.